All right, today we're going to dive into the really innovative architecture of KickLang. We're going to focus on a core concept that is honestly both super powerful and kind of elegant. The source material calls it the Meta-Workflow Substrate. But before we get into all the nuts and bolts, let's start with a big question, one that really gets to the heart of KickLang's design. What if a system's cognitive processes, its thoughts, what if they weren't built from scratch for every single new problem? What if they were built from a set of universal, reusable building blocks? Just hang on to that thought for a minute. So here's how we're going to break this all down. We'll kick things off with the big picture, KickLang's blueprint. Then we'll dive right into that core substrate. From there, we'll get into the 6 key actions, see how it all gets coordinated, and finally, we'll unpack what's called the interoperability kernel to really understand why any of this matters. Okay, so to really get what's going on underneath, you got to see the whole building it supports, right? This is the high-level architectural mental map of the KickLang system. As you can see, this thing is super modular. You've got a knowledge graph for data, a natural language interface, a processor for layered thinking, even systems for version control and feedback. But the one piece we're really zeroing in on today, the absolute heart of this cognitive engine, is sitting right there in the middle, the TAS Engine. So what is it that makes that engine tick? Now we're zooming in, moving from that big picture architecture to the foundational layer of the entire system, what the source calls the core substrate. And here it is. This is the central idea. TAS, which stands for Task-Agnostic Steps. The best way to think of these is as universal, goal-independent cognitive Legos. Seriously, they're not designed for one specific task. They're reusable, procedural archetypes. They're the fundamental actions that any part of the system can use to think and act. And this simple idea, it has some pretty revolutionary implications for building AI that can actually adapt. This quote right here really nails it. When you combine these simple, universal actions, they form that meta-workflow substrate we talked about. It's the bedrock. It's the very foundation that allows the system to intelligently break down complex goals and coordinate all its different parts. All the fancy reasoning is built right on top of this. So what are these universal building blocks exactly? Well, believe it or not, the entire system is built on just 6 fundamental actions that these task-agnostic steps can perform. Let's break them down. Okay, so it all kicks off with identifying and extracting the core steps from some high-level goal. Then the system structures those steps into a workflow that actually makes sense. Next, it layers cognition, which allows for really complex, nested reasoning. After that, it transfers knowledge between steps, provides context to make sure each action knows what's going on, and then, and this part is just fascinating, it can actually purify the tasks themselves, constantly refining them to be even more universal. It's a perfect, self-improving cognitive loop. So having these 6 individual steps is great, but how does KickLang actually coordinate him to tackle really complex goals without just getting lost in the weeds? How does it all work together? Well, what's so interesting here is how the system pulls off this coordination. The secret sauce is something they call triadic mapping. Now, it sounds complicated, but it's actually pretty brilliant. It just creates a super clear, continuous link between the high-level goal, the specific task actions being used, and the overall plan that organizes those actions. Every single thing is explicitly connected to everything else. And the result of this elegant coordination is what the source calls metacognitive continuity. The easiest way to think about that is the system always knows not just what it's doing, but why it's doing it. Because every single action is mapped back to a plan and a goal, the system keeps a coherent train of thought. And that's what allows for this incredibly complex, distributed, and even recursive reasoning across the entire architecture. So, at the end of the day, what's the big payoff for all this careful design? Well, this leads us to the most powerful concept that really emerges from this whole meta-workflow idea, the cognitive interoperability kernel. Let's put this into perspective, right? On one hand, you have traditional systems. They're usually siloed, rigid, built for one domain, and pretty brittle. Their knowledge is trapped. But KickLang's kernel approach, it's the complete opposite. Because it's built on these universal blocks, it's composable. It enables what's called cognitive scaling, which just means it can take on bigger, way more complex problems without needing a total redesign. And it's built from the ground up to share and transfer knowledge. So the crucial point is this. This design isn't just some clever way to organize tasks.
It creates a stable, universal foundation, that substrate we keep talking about, where you can build, combine, and scale complex reasoning systems. And most importantly, it lets them evolve over time. And that leaves us with one last kind of provocative thought to chew on. This whole architecture is based on one simple idea: standardizing the very act of reasoning into simple, reusable building blocks. So if you can actually do that, what are the limits? If thinking itself is a Lego set, what can't you build?